Good afternoon or good evening, depending on where you might be. My name is Kevin Michael Grace, and this is the KMG show for Thursday, January the 27th, 2022. And as promised, it's a COVID free Thursday. And I would like to do this every Thursday for as long as the madness lasts, which could be quite some time. But let's talk about the most important topic in the world right now. It's really a terrifying one. It's a threat to everything we hold dear, and that is people saying mean things about journalists. The journalistic community, if one can call it that, in Canada is absolutely obsessed with the idea that they are under attack. Now, why they would be under attack is not a question that they are willing to pursue, because the laptop class lives in a bubble, and anyone outside the laptop class is considered to be illegitimate, certainly not worth hearing, because all they do is spew misinformation and disinformation and uphold white supremacy and the like. Trending on Twitter is the hashtag enemy of the people. Yes, how about that? Someone called at the Reverie Waits tweeted, "The fact is, it's mainly straight white Christians who want to start a revolution against the government and are crying the hardest. They just can't stand the fact that people respect each other's differences now. They are the real enemy of the people." To which I responded, "Straight white Christians, don't you just hate them?" And yes, if you go to that hashtag, you will find many examples of why journalists are coming to be seen as the enemy of the people. Many such examples. But of course, if you disagree with their narratives, for instance, you know the Ukraine, that country somewhere in Europe that I'd never given 5 minutes thought to my entire life. The territorial integrity of the Ukraine must be supported by war if necessary. Someone called Crown Jewels tweeted, "Tuckio Rose." Oh, isn't that amusing? Tucker Carlson needs to be investigated. How many rubles did it take to buy this fish sticks soul? Follow the money. FISA, enemy of the people. Tucker Carlson has betrayed America. Well, I mean, he certainly betrayed the journalistic community, but there's a lot of that all over. Someone called Max Fawcett, who is a PR spiv, NDP hack, was tweeting out today that that certain people, certain horrible people, are ignoring, quote, literal experts, unquote. And I responded, literal experts, LOL. That the NDP has completed its transition from working class party to faculty club party. He had castigated a group of, unpersons. And I sent him back a response saying, "How dare these nobodies protest against their suppression?" And then he blocked me. Pretty sure university students don't talk openly about hanging journalists and overthrowing the duly elected government. But hey, it's been a while since I was on campus. Who else do we have in this? Oh, did you know that, hating journalists is bad enough, but the abuse suffered by female, or we might call them gendered journalists, and BIPOC journalists, is even worse. Rachel Gilmore, who works for Global News, aka the CSIS News Network, and if you look at her picture, her avatar on Twitter, it's enough to rouse fury. The smugness of this woman congratulating herself for being a good little sheep while wearing a Led Zeppelin t shirt, because that's what all the kids are into these days. Led Zeppelin. Maxime Bernier, who's the head of the People's Party of Canada and one of Canada's the establishment's number one hate figures, had tweeted, Teresa, someone called reporter Teresa, had tweeted, no journalist deserves to be attacked for doing their jobs and reporting the news, especially not by the leader of a political party. Rachel and Alex are damn good reporters. They're also very good and decent people. The abuse they're facing online today is unacceptable. Unacceptable. We've been hearing that word a lot lately. Maxime Bernier tweeted, pseudo-journalists spend years slandering a group of decent people fighting for freedom, calling them racist and white supremacist, and now they complain about getting online abuse. Poor things. You're not victims, you're liars, haters, and abusers. You reap what you sow. Hear, hear, Mad Max. Rachel Gilmore bleated in response, in 24 hours, I've been called a four-letter expletive more times than I can count. My boyfriend and sister have been harassed. I've had to report violent threats to the police. Yes, well, violent threats are one thing. Abuse, scurrilous or otherwise, on Twitter is quite another. Oh, look, I don't want to still be going on about this. No, journalists hate talking about themselves and what heroes they are. I'd like to focus on work, but we can't just pretend this is normal. This kind of hate is the rule for journalists, not the exception. BIPOC colleagues get it even worse. We can't let this be normalized. This is not normal. Yeah. Yes. And another journalist, former, so many journalists today are former jock sniffers, which really explains their mentality. Yes, you get to be called, how did you feel when you scored the game winning goal in overtime? I don't know. Pretty good, I would guess. But no, that's the kind of questions that they have, that they used to ask. Michael Malise tweeted in response to Mercedes Stevenson at, yes, she is with the CSIS News Network as well. Have you ever considered the possibility that you are the bad guys? No, 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 no. They're the good guys, and they're going to tell you about it every single day. Every single day. Another journalist, hang on, just let me bring this up here. Canadian journalists, the most sissified and yet arrogant people on earth. Jody Vance, and Jody Vance is a freelance journalist, et cetera, et cetera, from Vancouver, I believe. That she had tweeted something about something the government wants you to do, and go Canada go, and then get that thing that the government is telling you that you must have. And I responded, go, Gadarene swine, go. Here comes the 70s at Argent_631. Responded, says the woman who quit Sportsnet while being interviewed in the Jays booth and was always absent from her Leaf TV duties, a total flake. Do we have, what else do we have in terms of, oh, there's Bruce Arthur. Bruce Arthur is, oh my God, he is just so very upset. Apparently, there's a possibility that the panic porn that he has been supplying for 2 years now may be falling out of fashion. Maybe falling out of fashion. And I responded to him, why don't you switch to Sanka so you can stay calm and sleep nights? Yes, apparently there's a bunch of people in Canada, I don't know, a few tens of thousands, who are very upset at what's going on and they mean to protest. And how dare they? How dare they? Don't they understand that the government has everyone's well-being? That is their first priority. Well, everyone's well-being except the Untermenschen. I've talked about, I used to be a journalist. I was a journalist for many years, and I've talked about what I call reporter's disease. And I suppose there's two aspects of, or two characteristics of reporter's disease. We know everything about everything. No, you don't. Nobody knows everything about everything. And everyone cares about our obsessions, particularly political obsessions, as much as we do. People doing their own research. Can you imagine? That's what reporters do every day or every week or every month, is do their own research. Reporters are, with almost without exception, experts in nothing. You know, if you go to take your car to a garage, the person who is working on your car is actually an expert who has expertise. What is the expertise of journalists? Oh, and it's just a big pity party. Someone called Silas Brown tweeted, I'm so curious what the people who accuse journalists of lying think we get out of it, and like how this mass conspiracy is organized. Do they think you show up for your first day of J school and the profs are like, all right, kids, time to teach you how to lie? Well, pretty much, actually. When I was at Alberta Report, there was a reporter there who was always talking about J school because there were very few people at Alberta Report who had gone to J school, journalism school. And we just mocked him relentlessly for this. Bruce Arthur of the Toronto Star responded, when reality upsets you, it's easier to say the people telling you the truth are lying. And journalists, of course, they own the truth. There is no truth outside what journalists believe. They all go to the same schools and they all learn the same things. That's how it works. One of the biggest stories in Canada since last May has been the discovery of hundreds of bodies or thousands of bodies, presumably murdered and then dumped in mass graves with no markers. As I've been pointing out from the very beginning, there is no evidence of this. There is evidence of disturbed earth, but there's no evidence of bodies, and there's no evidence that these children had been murdered. Jonathan Kay, who used to be who was the head of the editorial department, the National Post, and is now an editor with Quillette. He writes, finally, every pre-COVID rubber chicken dinner hosted by Canadian journal groups had an obligatory speech about how we're so brave, challenging power, etc. Yet here we are taking orders from libs uncovering the biggest crime story in Canadian history. We're not brave, we're hypocrites. Someone named Mark Miller, and who is Mark Miller? He's an MP from Quebec, Minister of Crown Indigenous Relations. So you see as if the 700 plus Indian bands in Canada, they're somehow equal to the Crown. They are sort of a second state within Canada. He tweeted, the ghoulish demand to see corpses, one article is unashamedly titled, in Kamloops not one body has been found, but it's true, in Kamloops not one body has been found, is not only highly distasteful, but also re-traumatizing for survivors and their families. It deliberately ignores the comprehensive work of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and it calls to actions while also ignoring the deliberate and painstaking work that many Indigenous communities are undertaking in their continued search for truth, healing, and closure, not to mention Gibbs. It is crucial to highlight the impact of residential schools on survivors. Here we go again, just like Holocaust survivors, their families and communities, especially the fate of missing children, continues to have devastating consequences to this day. We cannot and must not ignore this reality. I will point out again that no one is missing unless someone is looking for them. The fact that so many young Indians in Canada disappear and their absence is not noticed by anyone, nobody knows or cares that they have gone missing, is a savage indictment of these Indigenous communities. Mark Miller continues, further, any author who glances over or ignores the testimony of survivors commits a basic error of scientific inquiry. Oh, yes, someone says that this bad thing had happened, or somebody told somebody who told me that this bad thing happened, and it must be true because that's science. So Jonathan K. tweeted, ghoulish, last year Canadians were told that these areas contained evidence of mass murder of children, no less. Some killers could still be alive and even putting others at risk. The remains could help identify and prosecute these killers. How is it ghoulish to seek justice? Assuming that hundreds of children were slaughtered in cold blood and disposed of in secret midnight burials, which is part of the narrative, we are dealing with the greatest crime in the history of our country. Every day that passes means the evidence will degrade further. Is there any other case where a nation is instructed that A, an incomprehensibly horrific crime was committed, children thrown into furnaces of pits, etc., B, that the evidence for such lies 2 feet under the surface, but C, that it would be ghoulish to investigate further? First Nations have been admirably forthright about the limitations of GPR, says Jonathan K. I'm not so sure about that. It is our government that instructs us not to ask questions and seek justice, almost as if it is more anxious to preserve their half-mast flag narrative than prosecute the greatest crime in Canadian history. Odd that. If it were alleged that white children were slaughtered and their remains buried in a specific location, can anyone imagine Mr. Miller lecturing us not to investigate the crime in timely fashion? By what 19th century racist logic do we not accord the same importance to First Nations children? Our government is gaslighting us with the claim that seeking justice for these murdered children is ignorant of, or worse, denying history. Imagine if bodies of Jewish children were said to lie under a park and our government denounced any attempt to investigate as a form of Holocaust denial. Yes, Canadian journalists are not brave and they are hypocrites. I mean, the obvious question, when it is claimed that there are hundreds of thousands of children, again, presumably murdered, and dumped in burial pits secretly, where's the evidence of it? You have made a claim. Where is the evidence of it? That's what a real journalist would ask. But we have a precious few journalists in Canada. Let's go to the chat. Hello to Emmett Kelly's Earth. Good evening, sir. And chat. Hello to Dan, Anran, William Hicks, Palcasso 88. Dr. Deadname says the hound's tooth suit, just a jacket, not a suit, and a floral lapel button, clearly a signal of some kind. The red tulip here is a symbol of resistance to a tyranny that is ongoing in Canada. Anran says the enemy of the people, but the scum of the earth will also do. Anran says, I'm proud to say I've never liked LZ. I don't know who that is. LZ? Let's talk about passive language in journalism. This is from Kane at Citizen Free Press. Cori Bush's car hit by gunfire. A vehicle belonging to Congresswoman Cori Bush was hit by gunfire, according to a source close to the representative who spoke on the condition of anonymity. According to the source, the vehicle was parked in the St. Louis area, and Bush was not in the vehicle at the time. It is not believed that Representative Bush was targeted, according to the source. When asked about the incident, Representative Bush told Five on Our Side in a statement, quote, Like far too many of us in St. Louis, experiencing gun violence is all too familiar. Thankfully, no one was harmed, but any act of gun violence shakes your soul, unquote. And this is a story from, yes, K on your side, from St. Louis by Casey Nolan. It's a funny power these guns have, just wandering around blasting away at people in the street for no reason whatsoever. Cori Bush, perhaps she doesn't understand or is unable to comprehend that it is her own people that are doing this, and that America is a country where it is not rare for children to be wounded or killed by bullets spraying in every direction. What kind of people would do that to their own people? Again, that's not a question that Cori Bush wants to entertain. Here's a story from the Washington Free Beacon. Taxpayer-funded study pays gay minors to report sexual activity without parental permission. The National Institutes of Health spent $8 million on this project since 2012. This research study pays gay and transgender boys as young as 13, that's the 7th grade, hundreds of dollars to report their sexual behavior on a mobile app, all without parental permission. NIH-funded researchers at Columbia University offer up to $275 to gay and transgender boys between the ages of 13 and 18 to document their sexual activity on My Peeps mobile, including whether they have condomless anal sex. It is difficult to understand how a 13-year-old could engage in activity without that being a crime, without that being, statutory rape. The NIH spent more than $300,000 to develop the app in 2012 and 2013, and $7.9 million since 2016 for Columbia researchers to study the data it collects, according to a government spending database. The app for young men who have sex with men provides interactive games and activities designed to teach participating teenagers how to minimize risk in their sex lives. Isn't that sweet? The scandal here is that it is a fringe newspaper. I don't mean that in an insulting way. So, such as the Washington Free Beacon, that's the only journalistic outlet to cover this scandal. The government of the United States is using taxpayers' dollars in order to normalize 13-year-old boys having, being buggered or buggering some other boy. But what, are you a homophobe or something? I mean, love is love, right? And, well, speaking of censorship, this is a very amusing story. And just what a hellish place China is. This is Steve Watson at Summit News. In a stark example of China's model of censorship and authoritarianism, a version of the 1999 movie Fight Club appeared online with an edited ending for a Chinese audience in which police figure out the whole plan, arrest the protagonists, and ship them off to a lunatic asylum. In the original ending, Edward Norton's character watches as multiple buildings explode, the culmination of his alter ego, Tyler Durden's plot to bring down a corrupt, consumerism-obsessed civilization. However, as Vice notes, in the version distributed in China, that end scene is cut and replaced with a black screen and a caption reading, quote, "Through the clue provided by Tyler, the police rapidly figured out the whole plan and arrested all criminals, successfully preventing the bomb from exploding. After the trial, Tyler was sent to a lunatic asylum receiving psychological treatment," unquote. The report notes that the film was edited by the copyright owner and then approved by the government before it was sold to streaming sites for distribution. The Chinese publisher of the film, Pacific Audio and Video, is an affiliate of the state-owned Guangdong TV. The author of the book on which Fight Club is based weighed in via a Substack posting, quote, Tyler and the gang were all arrested. He was tried and sentenced to a mental asylum. How amazing. I had no idea. Justice always wins. Nothing ever exploded. Fini, unquote. That's from Chuck Palahniuk. Ted Cruz responded, the second rule of Fight Club is we do and say whatever the Chinese communist censors tell us to do and say. Mark Cuthill responded, I bet the Chinese edit of A Clockwork Orange is about 10 minutes long. Jesse Bowman responded, Tyler's social credit never recovered, though. Human Rights Watch responded, dystopian. The first rule of Fight Club in China, don't mention the original ending. The second rule of Fight Club in China, change it so the police win. Watson continues, of course, this is entirely commonplace for all Western movies and shows played in China. As Bloomberg notes, a version of the 2005 movie Lord of War, starring Nicolas Cage as an arms smuggler, ends with the final 30 minutes of footage replaced with white text on a black screen saying, Yuri Orlov confessed all the crimes officially charged against him in court and was sentenced to life imprisonment in the end. Well, everyone loves a happy ending, right? Let's go back to the chat here. Hauper, hello, says bipedals are underrepresented in journalism. Zen Master Football Analysis says they are stone deaf. Emmett Kelly's Earth says, oh, I like this. That reporter is just buying a stairway to heaven. To which David Wright responds, not a whole lot of love for them, eh? I like their funny early stuff, says Hauper. Zen Master Football Analysis says the Canadians are getting a taste of what the Brexiteers had to suffer at this establishment hate mob called the Ramoners. And I'm betting Kevin's not a Led Zepp fan, says Hauper. Yeah, I don't know. They had a lot of good songs. Jimmy Page's production was revolutionary, one might say. I know that Ozzy Osbourne complained, how come our records don't sound like Led Zeppelin's? That's because Jimmy Page wasn't producing them. Apparently, it all came down to microphone placement. And, oh, yes, there's a meme out there. Well, it's been out there for a long time, called Jerk-Ass Homer. People on the internet complaining that, I don't know, after the first 5 or 6 seasons, that the character of Homer Simpson on The Simpsons changed radically. Yes, he was often a stupid, brutish man, but he made efforts to understand his wild son, Bart, and to make it up to Lisa, the child whom he neglected routinely. Well, apparently, John F. Harris of Politico thinks that President Jerkass will save Brandon's presidency. He writes, how trash talk can save Biden's presidency. The president may lack eloquence, but his outburst at Peter Doocy shows how he could harness his natural voice. Okay, I just point out that Joe Biden's natural voice is of a jerk, the kind of guy who, if he weren't in politics, would be routinely getting in bar fights over trifles. This is a man who, challenging people to a push-up contest? Oh, my IQ's higher than yours. Routinely lying about everything in his life. Oh, yeah, in 1959, I was with Wilmington with my dad, and there were 2 black men kissing on the street, and little Joey was rather shocked by this, but his dad, his wise old working class Catholic dad said, they just love each other, Joey, because of course that really happened. Like the phony academic laurels that Joe Biden has made up for himself. But anyway, John F. Harris writes, as a political communicator, President Joe Biden's most effective moments often come spontaneously when he is overcome with feeling or by accident when words that are intended to be private instead become public. You know, when his Alzheimer's riddled brain misfires again. Biden's bristling comment this week about Fox News reporter Peter Doocy was an entertaining example on both counts. What a stupid son of a bitch, the president muttered, as though to himself, even as a hot mic assured that this sulfurous thought bubble did not stay with himself. Biden later called the Fox correspondent for a conversation to clear the air, as Doocy described it. As the target of the insult, Doocy said Biden succeeded in doing just that. He didn't get an apology. You know, I suppose most reporters would be pleased to get a phone call from the president of the United States, but I remember when Ronald Reagan was president, some of you older listeners may remember this, that the CBS Evening News, this was back when evening news was a big deal, very important politically, and Dan Rather was the anchor, and it was like every night, frequently the lead story, the homeless crisis in America. And apparently Ronald Reagan was personally responsible for every single homeless person. Why didn't he just wave his magic wand or spend billions of dollars and make this problem go away? So President Reagan was rather troubled by this obsession of Rather and CBS News. So he called Dan Rather. And Dan Rather, rather than being pleased that the president of the United States had taken notice of his reporting and wanted to speak to him about it, he was insulted and accused President Reagan of somehow trying to silence him. What a jerk. Anyway, back to Politico. The air between the reporter and the president, of course, is not the most important air that needs clearing from Biden's perspective. It is the gap between the grand hopes Democrats had for his presidency a year ago and the present culture of a stalled agenda, a divided party, a rancid political culture, and the haunting sense that he may not be quite up to the task of turning all this around in time for 2022 and 2024 elections. Because it's always about elections. This is, see, reporters have gone, the journalistic community has become meta. Let's not talk about issues because issues are boring and require study and thought. Let's talk about polls. And let's not talk about, you know, what any office holder is actually doing or proposes to do. Let's talk about who's hot and who's not for the upcoming elections. Because again, that doesn't require any thought. Yes, the rancid political culture, which apparently is all Donald Trump's fault. Political culture was never rancid in the United States, not like when John Adams was insinuating broadly, well, more than insinuating, that Alexander Hamilton was a mulatto. Of course, hilariously, this became the Immigrants Get It Done musical Hamilton, based on the crazy idea that the founding fathers of the United States were somehow black, seemingly unaware of the fact that this all derives from a scurrilous insult made by John Adams. The whole encounter, including Doocy's genial refusal to get all huffy about Biden's flash of huffiness, was in its own way quite winning. It was also a reminder of how many memorable Biden moments feature casual profanity or bursts of authentic emotion amid the pervasive phoniness of contemporary politics. But wasn't Joe Biden supposed to be the great unifier, the fellow who was going to bring civility back to public life, the man who promised that anyone showing a disrespect in his White House would be fired on the spot? There's the famous time when he whispered to President Barack Obama at a White House podium that the passage of healthcare reform was a big effing deal. Or when he told an Iowa voter who pressed him on his ethical and physical fitness for the presidency, "You're a damn liar, man," before challenging him to a push-up contest. Again, these incidents suggest a man who was itching for bar fights. Perhaps Biden's most memorable moment during the fall 2020 presidential debates was when he responded to former President Donald Trump's incessant interruptions by rasping, "Will you shut up, man?" Ooh, tough guy. These exchanges offer a small window into potential remedy for a big problem. Biden has spent his adult life seeking and finally holds an office by which many conventional standards he is poorly equipped to hold. The modern presidency, at its core, is a communications platform. Key to its power, for better or for worse, is its ability to dominate public conversation. A noxious example is the all consuming grip Trump held on public attention. A more ennobling example is what Franklin D. Roosevelt meant when he said, "The presidency is not merely an administrative office. All our great presidents were leaders of thought at a time when certain ideas in the life of the nation had to be clarified." Unquote. So the fact that Biden lacks the expressive gifts of most predecessors is a serious liability. He can't use a grand setting to make a statement designed to echo across generations, as John F. Kennedy and Ronald Reagan did when challenging communism at the Berlin Wall. Do you recall Biden's address a few months ago to the United Nations? No, you don't, because it was a compound of gassy banalities organized around a string of rhetorical questions that recalled a high school valedictorian's speech. Last week's 2-hour news conference arguably blunted concerns about whether he lacks the endurance and mental acuity to spar with reporters. Are you kidding, Harris? Did you watch the speech? Have you seen the YouTube videos of him going, that thing, and then switching completely? And then later, and then pained silence. But the fact that his team spent the next day cleaning up his surplus candor when he warned Russia against a Ukraine invasion but said a minor incursion might not be such a big deal showed the perils of this format. Yes, North Korea invaded South Korea in 1950 largely because Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, had suggested the United States would do nothing about it. Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait largely because American diplomat Avril Glasby somehow she suggested that the United States would have no objection to Saddam Hussein invading Kuwait. These kinds of statements often have grave consequences. Yes, the perils of this format. Harris continues, at the other extreme, a fiery moral summons has its own risks for Biden, who is by temperament an accommodator. When he said Republican efforts to limit voting access amount to Jim Crow in the 21st century, some moderates in his own party warned he might be taking the comparison too far. When he journeyed to Capitol Hill to make closed-door remarks to Democrats to back him on the sweeping Build Back Better spending measure, he failed to switch votes and the measure stalled. How can a president lead with a voice that often fails demonstrably to persuade? Whether Peter Doocy is a jerk does not count as one of those great national questions FDR was talking about when he described the clarifying power of the presidency, but the encounter does point the mind toward two avenues in which Biden can become an effective communicator. The first lies in the very relatable nature of the whole episode. Yes, very relatable, that the most powerful man in the world must occasionally answer questions from reporters. This whole thing gives off the tremendous whiff of, lèse-majesté, that how dare you question the king? Doocy had asked him, do you think inflation is a political liability in the midterms? Biden responded sarcastically with the rhetorical equivalent of an eye roll. It's a great asset, more inflation. It's not really clear what Biden meant by that. It's not really clear what a lot of things Biden say actually mean. Harris continues, there is no chance that a hyper-articulate politician such as Pete Buttigieg would have handled the question in the same way. Ooh, go Pete Buttigieg. Biden must recall that he did not win principally with the votes of people who were impressed by Rhodes Scholars. Doocy said when Biden called him, the president said, it's nothing personal, pal. Pal? Are we pals? We were talking about just kind of moving forward. That thought actually does come close to one of FDR's certain ideas in the life of the nation that had to be clarified. In a diverse and fractious society, people inevitably are going to get jostled in the crowd. Pluralism requires muttering a plaint or two, brushing it off, and boarding the train to work. And he goes on and on and on. Oh, Biden's one strength as a political communicator is one he shared with an early mentor, Hubert Humphrey. No. Did Harris know anything about Hubert Humphrey? Hubert Humphrey reveled in the sobriquet the happy warrior. There is nothing happy about Joe Biden. He's a nasty creep and always has been. When he's not scowling and spitting rage, when he smiles, of course, Joe Biden has had so much plastic surgery on his face, he looks like the Joker and is mildly terrifying. Hubert Humphrey, indeed. Of course, back to the Canadian media, Jean Chrétien used to make up stories when he was prime minister about meeting ordinary Canadians in donut shops. Because, if the Prime Minister of Canada goes to a donut shop, why does he do this incognito? When everyone in Canada recognized his face, which is quite distinctive, that there was no one there to cover that, or that he went underneath bridges to talk to homeless people because, his security detail would tell him that, no, you don't have to worry about these people. They're all just so lovable. You're in no risk here. Jean Chrétien once walked, people were protesting him, and he once walked, hundreds of feet to grab a protester around the neck and choke him. And this was caught in photographs. But the Canadian media continued to tell us that Jean Chrétien is such a lovable fellow. Of course, the late Canadian columnist Alan Fotheringham came up with a marvelous quip that Jean Chrétien looks like the driver of the getaway car. But later we were informed by the media that we're not allowed to say anything about the way Jean Chrétien looks because he was crippled, handicapped in some way. Jean Chrétien, as it turns out, was unhappy with a school he was at when he was like 16 or 17 years old, and he faked the symptoms of a serious illness, of appendicitis, in order to get out of this school, and he kept it up. He acted so well that his harmless appendix was actually removed. Of course, we're veering into insanity here, but the Canadian media, that Jean Chrétien, so lovable, so relatable. Emmett Kelly's Earth said, during the campaign, Joe saw a sign held up by a man in Deschler, Ohio, saying, "Bring us together." And that became the great goal of his administration. Hello to Dionysus, who says, "I love fighting." Chokakin 666 says, "They lie when lies aren't even necessary. They're grandiose, narcissistic fabulists." Hello to Tom Anderson. Hello to Brandon Smith. Yeah, I'm reminded of commentary for Paul Schrader's movie Autofocus. And he says, there's this question, this widespread belief that Hollywood makes people evil. And Paul Schrader said, "I don't believe that. I think that evil people go to Hollywood so they can be evil." And I thought that applies to politicians. If any of you have ever known politicians before they went into politics, you may have noticed a change in their personality, that suddenly they become high-handed and condescending. And was it politics that made them that way, or they were just looking for an excuse to lord it over everyone? I believe the latter is true. Hello to Buddy. My upstairs neighbor is a demented vacuum fetishist, says Chokakin 666. Brandon Smith says casual profanity would help them come across as more trustworthy. Who's up and who's down, says Emmett Kelly's Earth. Zen Master of Football Analysis says he is an expert in the faux pas. When he accidentally said wetback, he immediately blamed his Irish blood, thus defaming a whole other group of people in the next sentence he uttered. Curious thing really? I shouldn't have thought that there were very many Mexicans in Wilmington, Delaware, when Joe Biden was growing up. That happened later. I think, to be fair, in the Fight Club book, it does end with Jack in an asylum, says God's own prototype. Halper says Page and engineer Glenn Johns put another guitar mic across the room for a natural delay. Innovative. Yes, exactly. I mean, it's just a monster guitar tone. Joe was right there marching with King in Washington in 1963, says Emmett Kelly's Earth. You know, this reminds me of something. Biden has claimed on several occasions that he was in when he was a senator, he was in South Africa and he got arrested. And somehow the world did not know about this. If a United States senator was in South Africa, protesting against the apartheid regime, this would be the number one news story across the world. Joe Biden keeps telling this story, and the media is, yeah, here we go again. Let's just pretend that didn't happen. Let's just pretend that these are not the ravings of a lunatic, because we want this lunatic to become president of the United States. In fact, we're desperately keen on this. I wonder, these journos, these J school graduates, if you gave them a drink or two or three and you asked them, doesn't that make you nervous a little that Joe Biden has the power to launch nuclear weapons? Actually, I think a lot of them would agree. Hello to Red Sulfur Cafe. Brandon Smith says a lot of guys end up like Bob Crane once they're, oh dear. I'm not going to repeat that. Corn Pop was a bad dude, says Tom Anderson. Indeed, he was. But there was a lesson learned there somehow, that apparently Joe Biden showed the world that he's not going to back down just because someone has a rusty switchblade. And as Joe Biden explained, they want to make their switchblades rusty, which makes them brittle and less effective, because of course you want your knife blade to be rusty. And of course, no one called him on that. Brandon Smith says, I was watching an 80s cartoon montage on YouTube, and there was a Burger King commercial that said, come on, let's have it. Tom Anderson said, KMG, when did journalism go from a blue-collar male profession to like feminist Ivy League grads? Well, J School had a lot to do with that. Of course, Pat Buchanan went to J School at Columbia University, no less. He turned out all right. But no, the idea of journalism as a profession, and when did this become solidified? Certainly by, the 80s. I'll tell you a story. A friend of mine, Lorne Gunter, who was one of my editors at Alberta Report, and a friend of mine, he got a job as a columnist with the Edmonton Sun. And later, he decided to leave Alberta Report, where he became a full-time columnist with the Edmonton Journal, which is the major newspaper in Edmonton. And so he had a football pool, an NFL football pool, when he was at Alberta Report, and he took that to the Edmonton Journal. This would have been 1996, I think. So he put up a poster in the break room at the Edmonton Journal in downtown Edmonton announcing his football pool, and it gave the details. And at the bottom, it says something like, or at the top, are you man enough for my football pool? And he was called into office, I don't know, by editor, managing editor, or whatever. And, Lorne, there's a lot you need to learn about working for the Edmonton Journal. That poster you put up was offensive. Offensive? How was it offensive? Well, you insulted women. I insulted women? I mean, it was just a joke. Well, perhaps you meant it as a joke, but it wasn't funny. And that's not the thing that we put up with at the Edmonton Journal. What a bunch of female journalists are going to burst into tears. I mean, you know how this works, right? NFL football pool, most women, their mind just shuts off. I'm going to look at something else here because I'm not interested in that, Brandon ate your typical dog-faced pony soldier. Again, that was this some sort of thing that he heard, in the 40s or 50s? I'm reminded, I think I may have told this story before, that when I was a boy, my father would take me to the barbershop, and I'd get a crew cut. And I didn't like that. And anytime my hair started to look, anytime I looked like I was not in boot camp, my father would drag me off to the barber shop and he'd say, "You look like a composer." And I thought, what? What does that mean? And then later I figured it out, Liszt, Mendelssohn, whatever. And I thought, is this, sort of thing slang that he heard in the 1930s? It must have been. But dog-faced pony soldier. Jim Smith says, my guess is that it came with the popularity of the Woodward and Bernstein Watergate coverage. Mandy Moore, any respect? No, actually. She was in this horrible anti-Christian movie. And she turned on her ex-husband, didn't she? Yes, Ryan Adams. All these people started attacking Ryan Adams, and oh yes, Ryan Adams, horrible, horrible man. Oh, and you saved it for now, did you? I see she is now married to Taylor Goldsmith of Dawes. There was a warning there, but some men are immune to warnings. Did Joe really stutter at some point in his life, or is this a false memory too? Who was it that the famous Greek orator who stuttered and put pebbles in his mouth? And eventually I forget who it was. Aristophanes, of course, he was a playwright. Someone in the chat will know. He may have heard that story growing up. I'm reflexively, if Joe Biden makes any claim about his past, I don't believe it. I simply don't believe it. Okay, we still not the Burger King commercial. We still haven't got the end to that story. Sadly, but moving on. Demosthenes, says Emmett Kelly's Earth. Thank you for that. What a clever bunch we have listening to my live stream. And in more American political news, this is from Kane at Citizen Free Press. Biden promises to nominate first Black woman to the Supreme Court. Biden just announced, quote, "I've made no decision except one. The person I nominate will be some of the extraordinary qualifications, character, experience, and integrity. And that person will be the first Black woman ever nominated to the United States Supreme Court." So it's officially a quota system now in the United States. Like all these people carrying on about Kamala Harris. She is the first Black vice president. Yeah, kind of, sort of Black. Not really. She's half Tamil, Brahmin, and was raised in Montreal in a Tamil Brahmin household, which really speaks to the American experience, doesn't it? No, we just tick boxes now. We're not looking for the best and the brightest. We just tick boxes. And of course, we get a short list, and this is going to be fun. It's going to be fun all the way around. If you've seen Associate Justice Sonia Sotomayor's dissents, they don't read like juridical decisions or juridical rhetoric. They read like they're furious Instagram posts. That's what they read like. This is from Nick Wiadek. Sorry, that's a tough one. Biden's Supreme Court shortlist. Ketanji Brown Jackson, 51. Yes, Biden tapped her to fill last year, now Attorney General Merrick Garland's seat on the D.C. Court of Appeals. Two sources close to the Congressional Black Caucus said that Jackson is viewed as a favorite and has long been on the group of influential lawmakers shortlist for future openings. She is a former assistant federal public defender in D.C. and clerked for several jurists. And here's a picture of her. Leandra Kruger has served as an associate justice on the California Supreme Court. J. Michelle Childs, district court judge in South Carolina, appointed by Barack Obama. Yes, born in 1966, she's still relatively young for a top judge, though she is older than other top contenders at a time when advocates have placed a renewed emphasis on jurists who have the potential to serve for decades. And other prospects, Leslie Abrams Gardner, who is touted by Cheryl Eiffel, head of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. But, what about the dark horse, a no pun intended, candidate? And again, this is too funny because the planted axiom here is that Kamala Harris, who's kind of sort of black, has been such a disaster as vice president. And vice president is one of the easiest jobs in the world and would be considered a lead weight around 2024 ticket, that she is going to be rewarded by being named an Associate Justice of the United States Supreme Court. There's a story from the New York Post. Could be credible. Speculation ramps up that Harris could be Biden's Supreme Court pick. As news broke around Supreme Court Justice Stephen Breyer retiring, speculation ramped up that President Biden could tap embattled Vice President Kamala Harris to replace him, keeping his promise to appoint a black woman to the high court while opening possibilities of a less politically tainted running mate for 2024. Former White House Press Secretary Kayleigh McEnany, and why anyone would care what she has to say, but never mind, on Wednesday endorsed the unlikely notion that Harris could get the nomination as a way to end the controversy surrounding her. I think it's a theory that could be credible, McEnany said while co-hosting the Outnumbered show on Fox News. The improbable idea was floated by co-host Harris Faulkner. Come on, this has been talked about for months now, and the New York Post is acting like they just heard it for the first time today. Biden has repeatedly said that he would pick a black woman as his first Supreme Court nominee, and Faulkner said that it's hard not to see at least Harris makes the list. Yeah, kind of, sort of, black. They don't know what to do with Kamala Harris in the White House right now, Faulkner said. I can't be the only person seeing this. So we're going to take Kamala Harris, who's a position with no power, and we're going to put her in a position with a great deal of power, perhaps for decades. Failing upward. But that's what the elite does now, right? Fail upward. Let's talk about the Great Replacement, or as we've been instructed to call it, Great Replacement is not happening, but it's a good thing that it is, the Great Migration, which is the same as the Great Replacement, but migrants are the bestest people on earth. Paul Joseph Watson at Summit News writes, during a television debate, French philosopher Alain Finkielkraut said it would take a fanatical denial of reality to disregard the spectacular demographic changes that are taking place in Europe. Finkielkraut, who is one of the 40 lifetime members of the 400-year-old Académie Française, which serves to safeguard the French language and culture, made the comments during a TV appearance on TV channel Europe 1. Finkielkraut asserted that attempts to shut down such debates by claiming mere discussion of a great replacement is dangerous or only serving to distract from a very real and obvious problem. Quote, this is in fact a fragmentation, and yes, this risk does exist, and in any case, I think the demographic change of Europe is extremely spectacular. The historical peoples in certain municipalities and regions are becoming a minority. A whole part of French people now live not in the suburbs, but beyond the suburbs because they are no longer the cultural reference they used to be because all the butchers are, for example, halal, unquote. The philosopher stressed that the issue should be treated with a lot of precaution, but demonizing it as racist is absurd and once again testifies to the fanatical denial of reality. The most vocal and outspoken candidate in the upcoming French election when it comes to highlighting demographic replacement is Jewish intellectual Eric Zemmour, a man who Finkielkraut insists is too radical. Zemmour has called for France's notorious Islamic ghetto no-go zones, which are routinely the scene of violence and mass rioting, to be reconquered by force. In a speech, Zemmour also warned that 1.5 billion Africans wanting to make their way to Europe represented the death of France. Now, this is a curious thing. In Canada, the United States, Australia, New Zealand, we're settlers here. And the land really belongs to the Aboriginal people. So we have no right to complain about the Great Replacement, replacing us in the country that our ancestors built. We're settlers, we're colonialists. So, keep stum, okay? But however, The indigenous people of England are English. The indigenous people of Ireland are Irish. The indigenous people of France are French, etc., etc., etc. That makes no difference. These indigenous people have no rights. And if they are to be overwhelmed by Africa and Asia, that's a good thing. So I'll boil it down to you for you. Immigration fervor, this oikophobia comes down to one thing and one thing only, which is that white people are evil and must be punished. There is no more, oh, yes, we still hear these people. Oh, what about the food? The wonderful food. Yeah, well, who was it? Mr. Bean fellow? When he was playing a young Tory in a comedy bit some years ago, he said, "We have the recipes now." And indeed, we do. Once again, there are quite a few sushi restaurants in Vancouver and Victoria. Almost none of them are run by Japanese people. They are invariably run, and the people who make the food there are Koreans or Chinese. Malmesbury Man tweets, a Zemmour presidency would see proud France extricate itself from the American protectorate. Zemmour laid out his geopolitical thought in a recent hour-long interview. He discussed Trump in the 2020 election, arms manufacture, Russia, Ukraine, and NATO, among other topics. The format of the program was a moderator, a Caroline Roux, along with several members of the media asking pointed questions and debating. The tone was contentious and at times tense. Zemmour was self-possessed and firm in his responses. Roux began by asking Zemmour if he takes Donald Trump as his foreign policy model. No, Zemmour answered. If I take anyone as a model, it would be Charles de Gaulle. Asked what displeased him about the way Trump conducted himself on the international stage, he responded, I didn't say he displeased me. But I don't take a president of the United States as a model. I try to define a foreign policy for France. Make France great again? Roux asks in heavily accented English. For me, France is always great, so I don't need again, Zemmour replies. Next, Zemmour is questioned by a French military reserve colonel and pundit named Pierre Servant. He asked, do you think the election was stolen from Trump? Do you think American democracy is functioning normally? Zemmour replies, I have doubts. I'm not aware of anything. I have no proof. I don't want to get ahead of myself. I'm thousands of kilometers away. I remember the election of John Kennedy in 1960 having been stolen. I remember the election of George Bush Jr. in 2000 having been stolen. So it wouldn't be a novelty in American democracy, but I don't have any proof. Servant follows that by asking, if you are elected and meet with Joe Biden, would you regard him as a usurper? And Zemmour responded, I'm an adept of realpolitik. So I take other nations as they are. I don't give moral lessons. I don't judge others more or less democratic, more or less liberal, etc. I do not define my foreign policy in relation to human rights. Joe Biden is elected. He's the legal president of the United States, so I know only Joe Biden. Next, they turn to Zemmour's well-known plan for France to exit NATO. Zemmour states, what is the legitimacy of NATO? You asked me about the legitimacy of Joe Biden, which of course I don't contest at all. On the other hand, I take the liberty of contesting the legitimacy of NATO. I think NATO is an organization that should have disappeared in 1990, 91, 92, when the USSR collapsed and the Warsaw Pact fell apart. Today, NATO only serves to justify American industry and the enslavement of European countries. It's what de Gaulle called back then the protectorate. I don't see the interest in continuing. I think France should be independent, and to show it symbolically, I would leave the integrated military command. But Zemmour says he would not leave NATO entirely for two reasons: to veto a possible admission of Ukraine and to prevent NATO from becoming an anti-China pact. Next, they discussed arm manufacturing. Zemmour advocates for a fully independent French arm industry, from the atomic bomb to the FAMAS, which is an old French assault rifle. He says that since Sarkozy brought France back under the integrated NATO command, France has taken the easy route and forgot the golden rule of General de Gaulle to be completely autonomous in our defense industry. Quote, today we have a military of samples. We have everything, but just a little bit. We could make war for 3, 4, 5 days, and then after that, we need the Americans, unquote. To rectify the situation, Zemmour would increase the French defense budget. Next, he is asked what he would do as president of France if Russia invades Donbass. He responded, nobody should fight for Donbass, not the US, not France, nobody. In fact, there is some unrest. Roux responded, is it necessary to set limits on Vladimir Putin? Zemmour replies, but you know Putin is not a child. You don't set limits on him. He is a head of state, a major head of state, leader of one of the biggest countries on the planet. He is very respectable. We should respect him, unquote. He goes on to discuss the history of the immediate aftermath of the fall of the USSR, when Bush Sr. and Gorbachev came to a tacit agreement that NATO wouldn't expand into the former USSR. Quote, obviously, the Americans haven't respected their word. Putin has tried, like all Russians, for 1,000 years to have a protective zone, and the Americans have spent the last 30 years eating away at that zone bit by bit. They took Poland, all the countries of Eastern Europe. Next, they went into Georgia, Ukraine. Roux points out America did not annex territory, and Zemmour responded, you know, the Americans are intelligent imperialists. They don't annex, they project, like all intelligent imperialists. I would like to know what the Americans would do today if the Russians started putting missile defense or troops in Cuba or Mexico. What I want to say is the Americans don't belong in Georgia or Ukraine. Putin's demands are legitimate. And that would normally be the role of France to say, in this situation, Putin's demands are legitimate. Pierre Servant then debates with Zemmour by casting Ukraine as a dwarf nation threatened by the immense Russian military. Ukraine doesn't threaten Russia, he argues. They simply want protection. Zemmour responds, it is not little Ukraine that threatens Russia, it's the United States. Servant replies, but the U.S. has lost interest in Europe. You know that has been the case since Clinton. Zemmour disagrees, but is cut off. Servant then raises the post-Soviet agreement with Ukraine to give up the nuclear weapons that were stationed there in exchange for an agreement for inviolate borders. Nevertheless, Putin in 2014 annexed Crimea. Zemmour answers, do you think it was good for global security for NATO to bombard Kosovo and Belgrade when Kosovo wanted to leave Serbia? Those were inviolate borders, and yet that doesn't bother anyone. As for Crimea, you know it has been Russian since the 18th century. To make a comparison, Lorraine and Corsica joined France at the same time under Louis XV and Crimea under Catherine the Great. And you know very well that Crimea was given to Ukraine by Khrushchev during a night of drinking. And more seriously, you know that the Russians would never accept the occupation of the port of Sevastopol by NATO forces with American arms and ships. You know, it is a telling indication of the world that we live in for a politician to be a patriot is considered shocking and dangerous. Again, such times we live in. Red Sulphur Cafe says Spaniards are a mix of Berbers, Celts, Romans, Visigoths, Jews, Arabs, and even Persians. Red Sulphur Cafe says Germans are a mix of Teutonic, Viking, and Hunnish tribes. Yes. And then they became a people over time. Yes, the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes invaded Britain in the, 5th century, and then the English became a people. Tom Anderson says Russia is surrounded by American military bases, and ever since the end of the Cold War, NATO has been expanding rapidly eastward. Red Sulphur Cafe says Crimea is more Russian than Hawaii is American, seized by fake coup d'etat. Yeah. Why is Hawaii a state? Why is it the 50th state? Well, you probably know this, but I'll repeat. There was a movement to make Alaska the 49th state, and Alaska is, of course, not contiguous with the United States of America, but it is in North America. And the Americans had owned Alaska since 1867, when it was bought, for $7.2 million. It was called Seward's Folly, after the Secretary of State. Hawaii is not American. It is simply not American. It's out in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. They have the native people there, the Hawaiians, and a large admixture of Japanese and Chinese. It is in no way American. But the Democrats would only agree to Alaska becoming the 49th state if Republicans agreed that Hawaii would become the 50th state. And of course, if Hawaii had not become the 50th state, America would have been spared Barack Obama and that insane senator they have. What's her name? Mazie Hiromo or whatever, who just, her hatred of the United States, she doesn't even bother to try to hide it. Emmett Kelly's said, could you review The Way We Live Now by Trollope someday? Oh, that's a good idea. Oscar Toe says, Kevin, do you think China will take Taiwan if Russia takes Ukraine? I'm not going to make a prediction on that. I mean, it wouldn't. I'm no good at it. Red Sulphur Cafe says, Americans freak when I mention Hawaii, LOL. But he says, I was surprised to learn Russian army didn't leave East Germany totally until mid-1994. Red Sulphur Cafe says, Puerto Rico was another fake annexation based on a false flag operation in Havana Harbor. Yes, indeed. And it is inexplicable to me that in 1946, the Philippines and the American army had fought a bloody war against the Filipinos for decades. That a lot of blood was spilt, a lot of American blood and a lot of Filipino blood was spilt to stop the Philippines from being independent. But in 1946, the Americans decided to give the Philippines its independence, but for some reason decided not to give Puerto Rico its independence. And since Puerto Rico, the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico, is part of the United States, but not a state, they don't pay state income tax there. And they have mobility rights to move to the United States. And since 1946, pretty much anyone with any talent, brains, or industry has left Puerto Rico. It is an absolute basket case now. Not as much as Haiti, but it's getting there. Tom Anderson says, China has no need to take Taiwan if they already virtually control it. Tom Anderson says, Macron would be more likely to extirpate France from American control than Zemmour. Okay, who else do we have here? Brandon Smith says, can't they just upload RBG's consciousness into an AI bot with a coat of blackface? Yes. Joken 666 says, Finkielkraut sounds extremely Gallic. Falling upward like Fauci after his AIDS fiasco, says Emmett Kelly's Earth. Indeed, indeed, indeed. Hello to Oscar Toe. Impossible to take those flabby fembots on the Supreme Court seriously. Well, Elena Kagan, as has been reported, when she was admitted to Harvard or whatever, it's just log rolling. Did you look at this woman's career? Powerful people promoting her. So I believe she went to Harvard. She was asked to write a 5-page essay on what? The Iliad, I think. Ooh, she was taken aback. She admits this herself. She puts this forward herself. What? I'd never written anything as long as 5 pages before. And who's Homer? And what's the Iliad? Really? So you get into Harvard and you've never heard of like a Trojan horse, Achilles' heel, in all the rest of the stuff that's part of Western civilization? You'd not heard of that at the age of, what, 18? Yes, and this is the sort of person who is appointed to the Supreme Court nowadays. David Wright says, didn't Joe raise the flag at Iwo Jima and then was rescued by a helicopter at the top of a building, what, in Saigon in 1975? Did Kamala move from Montreal when she was 18, or was it way sooner? Conflicting info, says Buddy. My understanding is that she moved to Washington, D.C. when she decided to attend Howard University. Now, I'd always assumed that she attended Howard University rather than a better one because she was determined to invent herself as an American and as a Black woman. Then later I found out that she got into law school because of affirmative action, which suggests that she is nowhere near as bright as her very bright parents. Justin Proto says, I've tried to take a heart attack to get out of work parties when my bosses would sing and play guitar. Worth it. Red Sulphur Cafe says, Tamil Tiger female blew up Rajiv Gandhi way back when. Tom Anderson says, Biden already narrowing himself to a sliver of 6% of the population. Well, yes, of course, Biden finished 5th in the New Hampshire primary, which just should have been the end, but the fix was in. The fix was in. And then he takes South Carolina and then just stomps Bernie Sanders in the South, all because, not because Black polls were paid off, but because Black people love Joe Biden. Do they Really now? The oh so tough on crime Joe Biden of the 1960s, the Joe Biden who boasted that he got along so well with George Wallace, the Joe Biden who supported segregation, that Joe Biden? Everything about this man is fake. Oscar Toe says, won't the Supreme Court confirmation get tricky with the admission that only a black woman will be considered? That's a good point. Oh, I like this. Ogan's Iron, they should nominate Kim Fox. Yes, indeed. She's really authentic. No flies on her. Let's talk about treason. This is Mark Edmonds from the Daily Mail. Exclusive, these people have no morals. They do what they want. Terrified farmers reveal mafia-like traveler gangs, hold them hostage, kill their dogs, and batter their families so they can hijack their land and make thousands out of illegal hair coursing. Yes, travelers or gypsies or whatever you want to call them have been creating havoc in Britain and in Ireland for decades. And what does the police do? Nothing. What does the government do? Nothing. Because they wouldn't want to be thought of as racist. And in the diversity file, this is again from the Mail, this time by Mark Dewell. Jewish community blasts BBC for whitewash non-apology after anti-Semitic bus attack report as Ofcom launches probe into coverage. What happened was that Jews were attacked on a bus by Muslims, and the BBC decided to memory hole that bit and blamed the Jews for being attacked because we don't want to annoy the Muslims. And here's another story from the Daily Mail by James Robinson and Kate Feehan. Terrifying moment, Jewish shop owners are beaten up on the eve of Holocaust Memorial Day as Boris Johnson calls attack on two men in a London street despicable, and Priti Patel says anti-Semitic abuse will not be tolerated. Well, we have the video, and it's a black man doing the beating, but we don't want to talk about that because diversity is our strength. Diversity is our strength. Oh, and who is it that's beating up? Stomping elderly Asian people in the United States. Overwhelmingly, it is black males, but we don't want to talk about this. Apparently, this is Donald Trump's problem. Donald Trump is responsible for this somehow. In a little while, I'm going to be talking about a remarkable movie from 1921 called The Phantom Carriage on Theater Thursday. So what's the latest on the puppet state, Ukraine? Well, I'm looking at the headlines at antiwar.com. Russia, Ukraine to uphold Donbass ceasefire. Ukrainian foreign minister says Russian troop numbers insufficient for invasion. Yeah, I don't know about that, seeing as that the Ukrainian army is a joke. Sticking to no weapons policy, Germany offers Ukraine helmets. Democrats rushing a massive Ukraine defense bill because, of course, Ukraine has now replaced Israel as America's greatest ally. This is from the American conservative Mika Meadowcroft. A German naval officer resigns his post after comments he made to Indians, not feather, offend some Ukrainians. It almost sounds like a joke. But no, that was Saturday, and as Vice Admiral K. Achim Schönbach drolly said in his Friday remarks to the Manohar Parrikar Institute for Defense Studies and Analyses, quote, "I'm not American, so I don't make jokes. I'm German. We have no jokes, and we can't even tell jokes," unquote. Schönbach has stepped down as head of the German Navy because he made the mistake of being honest, and not only about his read of the situation in Ukraine. His speech and responses to questions are worth watching in their entirety, informative, insightful, and at times, yes, amusing in his oddly Australian-sounding accented English. I confess to a certain jealousy of Germany now. Up to this past weekend, they were the kind of country that could elevate a man like that, where such a forthright sailor was not only promoted, but given the highest responsibilities. Meanwhile, our Ottoman Pentagon produces overstuffed political upholstery like Mark Milley. Yes. Schönbach said one thing, ladies and gentlemen, to make clear, you can really believe that Germany has no hidden agenda. As I said, we are Germans. We're probably not smart enough to run a hidden agenda, unquote. Schönbach was giving remarks on Germany's pivot to the Indo-Pacific region and the opportunities for cooperation and partnership with India. It is now, he said, citing other officials, German policy to acknowledge that the economic and political center of gravity has shifted from the transatlantic to the Indo-Pacific. The world's largest economies share Pacific coastlines, he said, referring especially to China, the US, Japan, and India. Thus, a rising China is not just the elephant in the Indo-Pacific room, a perhaps less tired figure of speech when actually speaking in New Delhi, but globally a systemic rival and a growing hegemonic power. That kind of language is optimistic, though, Schönberg said, confessing that in his opinion, China has been acting like an enemy. Though still a major trade partner with Germany, especially under former Chancellor Merkel, China is throwing its weight around as an economic power to cause divisions in the European Union and NATO, and the Germans are beginning to notice. None of that is terribly controversial. After all, America has been unsuccessfully pivoting to Asia from failures in the Middle East and the end of history in Europe for more than a decade. That China is a great power, no one denies. Schönbach got into trouble for talking about Russia. Quote, Russia threatens its neighbors with military force to prevent them from leaving the Russian sphere of influence. Interesting, we're talking about spheres of influence again. I thought we changed, overcame that. Now, if I didn't have it on his good authority that Germans do not joke, I'd be tempted to suggest there was something resembling a smile playing behind his eyes and twitching at the corners of his mouth as the Vice Admiral said that. The man does not seem to believe that we are one more trade agreement and one more round of sanctions away from a world without war. And Putin's Russia? What does he think they want? Speaking of the Ukrainian border, Schönbach said, quote, Putin is probably putting pressure on that because he can do it and he knows that he splits the European Union, but what he really wants is respect. He wants on eye level, he wants respect, and my God, giving someone respect is low cost, even no cost. It is easy to give him the respect he really demands and probably also deserves. Russia is an old country. Russia is an important country. Even we, India, Germany, we need Russia because we need Russia against China, unquote. Schönbach is in trouble, no longer the head of the German Navy, because he dared to acknowledge the implications of two things. One, in terms of sheer numbers, whether they be of men or money or machines, the economic and political center of gravity really has migrated from the transatlantic to the Indo-Pacific, making Ukraine not just a hinterland, but a backwater. Two, Ukraine cannot meet the requirements for NATO membership by any accepted standards because, besides being a Northern Virginia money laundering outfit, it is currently occupied. Its territorial sovereignty is already compromised, and Crimea is not going to be taken back. Do you risk a nuclear war for a backwater? Does it make sense after blinking twice, losing Crimea and the Donbass, to strongly imply you would like to make Ukraine a NATO member, which is tantamount to promising to drive Russia out of Crimea? And again, that was from Mika Meadowcroft in the American Conservative. And another piece from the American Conservative on Ukraine. This is by Bradley Devon. As tensions continue to escalate between Russia and Ukraine, the Ukrainian government's actors in Washington have kicked their influence into overdrive. News analysis from the Quincy Institute's Ben Freeman found the Ukrainian government hired just under a dozen firms registered under the Foreign Agents Registration Act, shelling out about $2 million last year to firms who lobbied on their behalf. Freeman described the Ukrainian lobby as small but mighty in a phone interview with the American Conservative and said their efforts to influence Washington and America's political apparatus are intense relative to their modest budget. FARA disclosures show that Yorktown Solutions, one of the lobbying firms hired by the Ukrainian government to work behind the scenes, recently received $1 billion from the Ukraine Federation of the Employers of the Oil and Gas Industry between December 1st, 2020 and November 30th, 2021. UFE-OGI members include the state-owned Naftogaz and several other joint stock and subsidiary energy enterprises. In that same period of time, UFE-OGI's Yorktown lobbyists made more than 11,000 connections, meetings, emails, and phone calls with representatives in government, from Congress to the State Department and the National Security Council, think tanks such as the Atlantic Council and the Heritage Foundation, and media outlets such as Foreign Policy, the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg, and NBC News. Freeman told the American conservative he's never seen something so expansive as Yorktown's efforts in its decade plus of analyzing FARA disclosures. Yorktown's FARA reporting shows that its lobbyists met with Senator Ted Cruz and at least two of his staffers, National Security Advisor Omri Sarin and Senior Legislative Assistant Samantha Leahy, on July 20th, 2021. Yorktown's president and signatory of the firm's FARA disclosures, Daniel Vajtich, served on Cruz's 2016 presidential campaign as the Senior National Security Advisor and chairman of the Russia Working Group. And there's much more. Again, this is from Bradley Devin at the American Conservative. I guess it's just a given that K Street runs America and to a large extent runs the world. K Street is a metronym for lobbyists in the United States, and American elected politicians do not work for their constituents. They work for lobbyists because lobbyists pay them off. And this seems intolerable to me, but it is tolerable. You remember when Bob Dole died a few months ago? Oh, Bob Dole. We love Bob Dole. Everyone loved Bob Dole. I don't recall everyone loving Bob Dole when he ran for president against Clinton in 1996. He was an angry, bitter old man, et cetera, et cetera. You know, his time had passed. And of course, he was referred to as the senator for Archer Daniels Midland. Yeah. Oh, yeah, gas-a-hole. Boy, that's really a good idea, right? And ADM wanted to subject Americans to gas-a-hole, and Bob Dole made sure that this happened, and ADM was quite grateful, as they should have been. No one seemed to question why Bob Dole would be moving heaven and earth to help a private company. Well, they're not going to ask that question because they all do it. I don't know how many of you have heard of George Weigel. He's a nasty, dangerous man whose influence in the Catholic Church has had very unpleasant consequences. One wonders about his sanity. John Paul II, greatest pope ever, and John Paul II's theology is a bomb which is going to explode in the Catholic Church. He actually said that. He actually wrote this, George Weigel. Bombs are bad things. Bombs kill people and, destroy property, as well as, terrorizing people. But, he just loved JP2's theology, including the theology of the body, which only about 5 people on earth even pretend to understand. That's how much George Weigel loved it. Weigel is one of these, John Paul II, there were a fair number of people like Jason Kenney who became Catholic during his papacy because JP2 was so pro-free market. Well, he wasn't really. Oh, and that he won the Cold War personally. Well, no, he didn't. Political reasons it's very strange that people would convert to any faith for political reasons, but there you go. And George Weigel is a neocon, one of the leading neocons. He has a piece in First Things called Russia, Ukraine, and the Moral Reckoning. Yes, that George Weigel is going to lay down the law about morality. And then he starts talking about this not very good film from 1961 by Stanley Kramer called Judgment at Nuremberg, and citing, among others, the performance of Montgomery Clift. If you've ever seen the movie, Montgomery Clift is so out of it on alcohol or drugs or whatever that he seems barely human. And somehow there were no Nuremberg trials in Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. So that means that the Soviet Union is a very bad place. Let's drag Stalin into this. Putin's Russian regime is a danger to the Russian people and the world, and will likely remain so until the kind of moral and historical reckoning that took place in Germany after World War II takes place in Russia. The Russian Orthodox Church, which has immense spiritual resources, could play an important role in a national examination of conscience. It will not do so, however, so long as its leader, a patriarch Kirill, teaches as he did recently, that his country's current social condition is a manifestation of God's mercy, even as Kirill proclaimed that Russia is the leader of the free world. Yes, I wonder if George Weigel knows enough about Russia and the Slavic people, how they think, to know of a well-known and an old Russian belief that Russia now occupies a place formerly held by, well, among others, Rome, that Moscow is the fourth Rome. I wonder if George Weigel has ever heard about that. I recently got into a Twitter contretemps, which went on for some days until it bored me and I stopped responding, with this fellow who admitted that he'd never heard of Stepan Bandera, but was going to lecture me about the Ukraine. Of course, that sort of thing is not at all uncommon nowadays. Matt Beck, hello, says, I know George Weigel quite well. He's indeed a piece of work. JP2 is a heretic anti-pope. Pelcasso88 says, KMG is right. Clift's acting is ridiculously over the top. He'd been in a serious car accident as well before this movie was made. It was just terribly disfiguring. Shatner was in it, says Pelcasso88. Something Gameston says McCain got the same, but in all fairness, he did suck. Oh, of course, when he died, we all loved Senator McNasty. Really? The guy who claimed, in his failed 2000 president bid for the Republican nomination, claimed with a straight face that George W. Bush intended to make the United States a theocracy? Yeah, really. Oscar no, I can't. We're not going to say that word today. Jokin666, that German naval officer wears his cap at a rakish angle like a U-boat, a commander. Okay. Gwen Ifield's cousin is in the running for the Supreme Court. Nope. Another one about that word I can't say. I guess you could use the alternate racist claim. What about Asians or Hispanic ladies? What about that bald, tattooed lesbian judge, says Chogokin666. Yes, what is it? This is Massachusetts. And I asked the question, are they breeding literal ghouls there now? It's just a picture, but I looked this woman's name up and there's a feature on her, and I sort of started back from my computer and I'm scared. Maybe this woman has spectral powers. Let's talk about women and infertility tomorrow, then, because I want to talk now about my choice for Theater Thursday, which I believe is only the second silent film that I have reviewed in the years that I have been doing this on live streams, and it is called the Phantom Carriage. Wagon Master, Wagoner, that's what it literally means, the Swedish title. And it is directed by and stars Victor, how is this said? Wustrom. I think that's right. It's close, I think. And it is really an extraordinary movie. First, something about Wustrom. He was, let's see. He was born in 1879 and died in 1960. He is best known among cineasts because he played the leading role as an old professor looking back on his life in Ingmar Bergman's Wild Strawberries from 1957. We tend to think of film cinema as an American invention. It isn't. The Americans got good at it quite early. But there were, there's a thriving film industry in the early days in Britain and in France, of course, and in Germany and in Sweden as well. Wistrom went to Hollywood. Hollywood was offering big money And so we all know about Murnau and later Hitchcock and so many others went to Hollywood. And Wistrom did too. And English language films he made include He Who Gets Slapped and The Wind. Eventually, he tired of America. He had a leg up in America because he grew up. Well, he spent the years 1 to 7 in Brooklyn. And then when his mother died, the family returned to Sweden. Of course, given that he made films at the dawn of the film industry, many of his films are lost. And I have to say that it is something of a small miracle that the Phantom Carriage actually exists in a form which is watchable. It was not available for many years in, again, a watchable print, but then extensive restoration, basically fitting 2 different language versions together, was done. And I shall point out that some of this is governments are sometimes involved with this, or quasi-governmental agencies, but to a large part, the restoration of films is accomplished because of the assumption that people are going to buy Blu-rays. And if, we're told that we don't need physical media anymore, but it is one of the wonders of modern filmic history and one of the joys of my life that many films which had been written off because, well, they're not available, no one can see them, and if you could see them, you wouldn't want to. Like Stanley Kubrick's first film, you could watch it in an nth generation video copy, but it just, it gave me and everyone else such a headache that you turn it off after 5 minutes. So this is a difficult movie to get into. And this has to do with the structure of the film, which features flashbacks within flashbacks. At the very beginning, it's explained to us, we see a woman who is dying of tuberculosis on her deathbed. And there's another sister, Salvation Army. She's a Salvation Army sister. There's another one, Maria, there with her. And she has a final demand before she expires, which is she must speak with David Holm. Now, for the longest time in this movie, we don't know who David Holm is, what his importance is, why this saintly Salvation Army sister felt the need to speak to him on her deathbed. The movie explains. Now, this is a slow burner, as they say, so much so that it was radically re-edited when it played in the United States, and it appeared around the world with several different titles, presumably because various film companies in various places in the world did not know how to categorize this film. Well, how would one categorize it? Well, it's a melange of genres. You could call it a melodrama, which it is. You could call it a ghost story, which it is. You could call it a didactic picture, which it is. A didactic in the sense that it shows the perils of falling in with bad company. It shows the peril of drunkenness. It shows the terrible fate that awaits those who mock God. And interesting use of metaphor in the film that drunkenness is seen as something of a virus, if you will. Now we have parallels in the film between drunkenness and disease, communicable disease, in this case tuberculosis, but also sin. that sin is transmitted from person to person to person. Now, of course, we're all responsible for our own actions. We all have free will. But again, we are warned to avoid bad company, because our resistance to sin, to evil, will be worn down by this exposure to sinners. And this is shown very, very powerfully in this film. There is a myth or a legend at the heart of this film, which is the phantom carriage, or the haunted carriage. That the significance of New Year's Eve is at the fore. Of course, New Year's Eve is the last day of the year, December the 31st. This film premiered in Sweden on an auspicious day, January 1st, 1921. And the lesson is the legend is that a man who dies on New Year's Eve, midnight, is condemned to be the wagoner of this haunted carriage. And for 1 year, he must collect souls of the dead. Now, I mentioned that this is a ghost story, and I need to talk about the cinematography of Julius Jensson and the editing of Eugen Hellman. That, of course, this movie is over 100 years old, but the special effects are absolutely spectacular. That we see ghosts. We see ghosts arise from dead bodies. We see ghosts pass through people. We see them pass through doors and walls. How is this accomplished? By the use of superimposition and layers of superimposition to give form and solidity to ghosts, to phantom entities. There's a line of sinfulness here that goes from someone to this character, George, who'd been to the University of Uppsala and knows more than the rest of us, who had become terrified on New Year's Eve. And he corrupts a man called David Holm. David Holm worked in a woodworking factory, and he had a wife and 2 lovely children, and he threw it all over for drink. And this film is, it's based on a novel, a best-selling novel in Sweden, and you can see the influence of Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol in it. The ghost being shown things that happened. It's also rather Dostoevskian in that we inhabit a lot of low places, taverns, hostels, and a memorable scene of people ushering in the new year, getting very drunk in a graveyard. And of course, this suggests the terrible sin of Don Giovanni in Mozart and Da Ponte's opera of the same name. I've often spoken on Theater Thursday of my delight with location shooting, but this film, Sjöström's earlier films had been shot on location. He decided, and Selmer Lagerlöf, who wrote the novel, wanted it to be shot on location, and she had locations in mind. But Sjöström insisted that it be shot in a studio. And this was a wise decision because one can completely control the mise-en-scène of the film when one is shooting in a studio. And it has really brought home to us just the squalor of the taverns and the hostels and the tiny the tiny bare apartments that the Sweden's poor would occupy, or the tiny rooms and houses that they would occupy. So David he abandons his wife and his children. Well, then his wife abandons him. He doesn't work. He just manages to get hold of money, presumably, by stealing things from his wife. And he manages to corrupt his brother. And his brother becomes just as dissolute as he. We see David Holm, we see him in prison, where he's been arrested for public intoxication. And his jailer, or the head of the prison, presumably, he's not identified, wants to show him something and takes him to a nearby cell where there is his brother. And the jailer informs Holm that his brother had killed someone in a drunken brawl and would now spend many years in prison. And the jailer suggests that it would be just for David Holm to take his brother's place, because it was Holm who led him to a life of dissipation. Now, Holm is absolutely horrified by what has happened to his brother, what his brother has done, and his whole role in this. And we see repeatedly throughout The Phantom Carriage that David Holm, who is played by the director of the film, Victor Sjöström, that he is given many, many chances to repent his ways, but he refuses. He always refuses ultimately. And David Holm is one of the nastiest characters ever to appear in a movie, any movie that I have seen. And this characterization, which has been suggested that Sjöström based him on his own father, that it demonstrates to me the horror of resentment. I believe that resentment is the most corrosive quality in a person. And Sjöström is angry at the world. He develops tuberculosis, and he actually says that I cough in people's faces deliberately. Why should they be better off than me? That he coughs into a rag and then rubs it into his small children's faces, attempting to infect them. He is cynical, sarcastic, violent, who meets kindness with the mendicant snarl. He's like an angry dog. And he comes into the ken of Edith, the Salvation Army nurse, played by Astrid Holm. And it is New Year's Eve. And shortly before midnight, he is ringing the bell. And this Salvation Army mission is new. And there are just two sisters there, and their facilities aren't complete. And of course, the sisters understand that, someone coming at 11:45, this person, could be trouble, could be dangerous. But Edith is such a kind-hearted person. And she is rather thrilled by the prospect of this mission having its first visitor. Particularly, it's so auspicious that it is right before the beginning of the new year. And so she takes in Holm, who angrily, sarcastically says, I'm not interested in food, because they wanted to feed him. I just want a place to sleep. So they take him to a bed, and he flops down. He throws off his hat, and he takes off his jacket, which is torn, rent asunder, and he flops down on the bed and immediately passes out. And Edith takes up his coat. She is warned against this by Maria, because our sterilizing oven is not yet ready, and this coat is likely, riddled with disease or parasites. But Edith decides that she is going to stay up all night, mending his coat, and she is so delighted by this, the opportunity that she has to help another person. I mean, Edith is I suppose her character has been criticized because she is in some ways, a saintly character. She says, she prays when it turns midnight, and she says, "Dear Jesus, let our first guest be blessed with a happy year." Well, it's not a happy year, but it's not Edith's fault. And we are instructed through an intertitle that Edith is guilty of the sin of hubris herself, because she believes that she has the power to make men good. And of course, no one has that power. I mean, not even God has that power. People must choose to do good, just as they must choose to do evil. But it is difficult to watch this film and not be carried away with admiration for Edith, especially in these days when we have nurses doing TikTok videos and reminding us all the time that they're frontline workers, and they keep us alive. By the way, the sinister threat implied in that is not lost on people. Edith simply wants to serve God and help other people. So the next morning, when Holm wakes up, he is mystified by his mended coat. So he comes into the kitchen, and he is served breakfast and coffee. And he asks Sister Maria, "Is it you who mended my coat?" And she says no, and indicates that it was Sister Edith. And Sister Edith comes out, and David Holm he's quite touched. He's rather, overwhelmed by this kindness. And then he decides his mood darkens. He decides he's leaving immediately. And Edith says, "But you must visit again on the next New Year's Eve." Now, this comes true in a sort of unlikely fashion, if you will. It's as if much of the drama in this movie seems to come from a sense of preordainment, And so his mood darkens. He's going to flee, and he tears up his jacket. All of the patches that have been put there, all of the fixes, he tears them off, and he says, "This is how I like it. I'm used to this." Almost spitting in the face of Edith's kindness. Later, when she buttonholes him at a low tavern, the Salvation Army is there, and they're handing out posters, and he is given a poster, David Holm, and he crumples it up and he throws it in her face and mocks God. "This twaddle," he says. Well, Edith has come to the conclusion that he must be reunited with his wife, that this is the only way that he can be, his wife and children, because this is the only way that he can be saved. Well, it's a bad idea. It is a bad idea because this leopard does not change his spots. Usually the Salvation Army has given him a fine new suit and a bowler hat. Soon enough, we see him wearing his, crushed, formless hat and his near rags coated with all manner of filth, because that's the way he likes to live. He likes to befoul himself. And of course, there's a famous scene in this movie, which was, if you will, borrowed by Stanley Kubrick for The Shining, the one with Jack Nicholson and the axe. And there is much of a kind of a feel of this film in Kubrick's Shining overall, in terms of its family relations, how, one man can poison a whole family. Of course, Bergman was greatly influenced by this film, made a documentary about it, and you see its themes. Some of its themes appear in Wild Strawberries, which, of course, Victor Huistrom starred in. So Georges has become the wagoner of the Phantom carriage, and he finds himself. It's New Year's Eve, and as mentioned before, well, we have three men who are drinking it up in a graveyard, and they are waiting the new year. And of course, David Holm knows about the legend of the the Midnight Death and of the Phantom carriage, but this does not stop him from desecrating a graveyard. And he is informed that Edith is dying, and that she has expressed a wish. She had pretty much a posse had been sent out to try to find David Holm, but he couldn't be found because he had his wife, as previously mentioned, his wife and two children had deserted him for obvious reasons, and he was on a hunt to find her, and to kill her. So he's moving from town to town, and he ends up in this one town where Edith is, and he refuses to see Edith and gets into a brawl with his drinking partners because they cannot believe that he is so unfeeling, that he would refuse to honor the dying wish of such a kind woman. And he is beaten to death in this brawl, whereupon the Georges, the wagoner, appears with his carriage and his spectral carriage and his spectral horse, and informs him that he is the new wagoner, and you have no choice in the matter. And he binds his wrists and his ankles with invisible bonds. A very beautiful scene. And he gets put into the carriage, and but Georges has something to show him, which is he takes her to the deathbed of Edith, and he shows him in another flashback, the misery that he had caused. Some of the examples of the terrible misery that he had caused through his selfishness and sinfulness, and he is absolutely aghast at this. And Edith wants to make a bargain with the Grim Reaper, with his scythe. Again, obviously an influence on Bergman's The Seventh Seal. His cowl. And she wants to live one more day so that she can do her best to reunite David Holm and his wife. That's the reason for the search for her, her final wish in life. And so this is granted. I'm not going to spoil the ending for you. It's emotionally overwhelming. I was choking back tears myself. And of course, we learn of the statement of George, which becomes very significant. To sum up the theme of this film, George says, David, if I could send a message to mankind, I would send them a New Year's greeting. I would like them to dwell on a single New Year's prayer. Lord, please let my soul come to maturity before it is reaped. This film is available on Blu-ray from Criterion. Now, a film that's over 100 years old, there's going to be some problems with it. Most of the film is tinted. Some of it is not tinted, and that's because of the hybrid nature of the restoration. There are some scratches, hair that could not be removed for a couple of minutes. There is some, juddering and some weakness, particularly in the early part of the film. But overall, this is not a difficult film to watch technically. I really have to say that I didn't see this film until this week. and I'm 66 years old, and I'd like to think that I'm a better man for having seen it, which is a rare claim that I can make for any film. Again, this is a slow burner, and the nature of its plot is somewhat perplexing. But I would advise, and some people hate silent films, but I would advise people to persevere because this film really packs a punch. It is certainly one of the greatest films that I have ever seen. It's a silent film with the Criterion Blu-ray. You get two soundtracks, one of them an electronic one, and one from a Swedish musician who has assembled, what would you say, as like salon orchestra, some percussion, piano, accordion, strings. It's quite effective, actually. So those are my thoughts about the Phantom Carriage. Let's go back to the chat. An unfinished Jack London book. That was the Assassination Bureau. It was a plot that Jack London had bought, and he didn't finish it. It was later finished by a separate hand. Media Hit says they had Zeppelins around during the latter part of Jack London's life. They must have thought it was going to take off, not the airplane. Let's see. Then again, per William Friedkin, most of the black extras in the bar scenes, I suppose that's The Exorcist, were off-duty cops. What that movie shows Popeye beating up black drug dealers and flushing their drugs into the sewer, instead arresting and charging. That's Media Hits again, talking about what, the French Connection. Okay, yeah. Oh, the bar scene, not the bar scene in The Exorcist, bar scene in the French Connection. It really seems like ancient times watching the French Connection. Just these cops just rampaging, through the ghetto, and there's just two of them, and I don't know, there's 50 black people or whatever, but such was the I don't know, the implicit or implied power of these two white cops, that you have all these black lowlives, and most of them criminals, just doing as they're told. What else do we have here? The N-word usage in the French Connection, says Anren. Well, look, come on. It's only in the last few years that we've been gaslighted to believe that the N-word is the most horrible utterance that is possible for anyone to make. That one can blaspheme God all one wants, but to utter that 6-letter word condemns one to perdition. Never mind, has been pointed out by many other people and by myself many times, most black people hear that word or say it 50 to 100 times a day, and they don't burst into tears or fly into a murderous rage. So no, it was a word that polite people did not use, but no one is going to, not that long ago, no one was going to, fly to pieces if it was said. Media Hit says Friedkin was a 60s radical looking to overturn the death penalty for a black man on death row for murder. The man was found not guilty, and it was later found out he actually did it. It made Friedkin right wing. Yes, I've read Friedkin's autobiography, and he's admirably honest about that. I had a similar experience when I was a boy. There was a book, a bestseller, and it was called Brief Against Death. And it was written by a man called Edgar Smith, who had been convicted of raping and horribly murdering a young girl, 16 or 17 years, Zelinsky, I think her name was. And he went to prison, started reading. He didn't have an education to speak of. Started reading, joined Mensa. He tested his IQ, tested over 140. And he started corresponding with William F. Buckley Jr., and Buckley championed this fellow, and I suppose helped him get a book deal and wrote an introduction to the book. And I read the book, and I thought, this is a compelling story of an innocent man being railroaded and being condemned to spend the rest of his life in prison. And I remember I gave the book to my father. How old would I have been? Like 15 years old or something. I gave the book to my father, and he read it, and he said, he's guilty. And I thought, oh, yeah, that's exactly the sort of thing I'd expect from you. And then after he was released from prison, Edgar Smith went to Las Vegas and went on a crime rampage and was arrested. And he called, he was on the run, and he called William F. Buckley, who I think hung up on him, and called the police. And then after he was arrested, Edgar Smith cheerfully confessed, sadistically confessed, yes, I was guilty of killing Vicky Zelensky. Yeah, ha, 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 ha. And I pulled the wool over your eyes. How about that? Yeah, of course, William F. Buckley once said that he'd asked Truman Capote, who, of course, the author of In Cold Blood, if he ever met any of these prisoners who were innocent. And Capote smiled and said, I never met one who wasn't. Yeah, very droll comment there. Let's take a final look at the chat. Andy McDowell was pleasant in Groundhog Day and not bad in The Object of Beauty. Depardieu is fantastic, says Oscar Toe. Indeed, 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 he is. He's become rather large lately. I just watched a documentary called Friedkin Uncut. It was quite good, says Picasso 88. The 12 Angry Men. Oh, I don't like that. It's just this smug 50s liberalism. Of course, watching these old TV shows, like even a show like Naked City, I had until I rewatched it decades after it was first presented, I just had no idea just how liberal it was. You watch all these famous Westerns, the Western TV shows, they're all liberal. They're all liberal. Anyone who, expresses dislike of American Indians, well, there might as well be, a neon sign flashing at them saying the villain, because, no one in the Old West would have any reason to dislike Native Indians, right? Okay. Stanley Kramer was a hack, says Ann Runn. Senator McJerkface says British American. Of course, he really was. Senator McNasty, he really was such a nasty man that, everyone loves him. The Arizona legend. Oh, let's not talk about savings and loans or anything like that. Let's not talk about his conspicuous failure as an aviator, crashing planes, stunting and the like. Let's not talk about how he ditched his wife when he got back to America, first chance that he got to marry a woman whose father controlled the Anheuser-Busch franchise in Phoenix. Let's not talk about any of that. Let's not talk about how he loved to entertain reporters by talking about, Vietnam and talking about gooks. And, oh, wait a minute, shouldn't the reporters have been horrified, outraged at this? No, because it's Senator John McCain. So he has the right to say that, and we're not going to get offended, But, I suppose McCain, he learned something about reporters, which is something that Joe Biden doesn't understand. And it's pretty simple. Reporters love to be flattered, and they're very easily flattered. If you make friends with a reporter, pretend you're friends with a reporter, you're going to get positive coverage. Back when I was a reporter, I wanted to speak to this fellow. He later became a senator, and he was the leader of the Alberta Liberal Party, which was, almost a nullity, in Alberta. And although they almost won the election in 1992, but that's because the Conservatives, acted like Alberta Conservatives, corrupt and hapless. So I called this fellow up, and he called me back really quickly. And he said, "Hey, Kevin, how you doing? What can I do for you today?" And I thought, I like this guy. And so I asked him questions, and he gives me, he gives good copy, right? And so I wrote this story, and it was rather favorable to him. And then it hit me. Why did I, give so much attention to a man who was insignificant in Alberta politics? But of course, he was all over the Canadian media, all over the Canadian media. Why? Because he understood the secret. Make nice with reporters, and they will fall in love with you. Ah, remember on Saturday mornings after cartoons, they used to play Chinese kung fu shows, says Oscar To. MeTV used to have noir TV show on Sunday nights, showing back-to-back Sin City and the Alfred Hitchcock show. Not as good as Twilight Zone or Night Gallery. I love the Alfred Hitchcock show, actually. Uh, yeah, I remember this scene in The Naked City where it was Paul Burke playing this cop, and what his wife or his girlfriend was the lovely Nancy Malone. I always delighted to see her in anything she was in. So there's going to be an execution, and his sadistic boss insists that he be present at the execution, that he actually watch it, right? Oh, I think this would be, good for you. Yeah, there's nothing cruel and unnecessary about that, But, I guess the death penalty is wicked, right? So, there it is. And yeah, all liberal, all of these shows. That famous Twilight Zone episode, there's going to be the Russians apparently have launched missiles, and the missiles have been spotted, and they're going to be landing, and we're in some Westchester County suburb or whatever. And this one fellow, a doctor, he's got a wife and a child, and he's built a bomb shelter, right? And well, he was the wise one. He built his house from bricks, not straw, right? And so the neighbors know about this, and they all demand to use the bomb shelter. And he explains, reasonably enough, that it's built for 3 people. And there's problems with food and water and air and the like. Well, why do you get to stay there? Well, because I don't know, I had the foresight to build it. And then kind of war breaks out between everyone else and the man with the bomb shelter, and amongst themselves. Well, maybe we could get one more family in there, right? But it should be mine. And then, for no reason at all, one of the neighbors, he starts yelling at. He gets into physical with this other neighbor, and we learn his name, Weiss. Oh, I get it. He's Jewish, and he starts raging about immigrants and pretend Americans and the like. Okay, that seemed kind of gratuitous, Okay, let's have a final look at the chat and see what we got. Okay, what is on MeTV after Kevin? Okay, what's coming up? Well, tomorrow is the book club, and I am going to be discussing, hang on a second, The Great British Dream Factory by Dominic Sandbrook. And on Music Monday, I am going to be discussing big music, world-spanning music, which I guess began, classical music, which began with Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, which was not very popular for the longest time because a lot of people were asking the question, the same one that Glenn Gould asked many years later, what is this about? And then, of course, we had Mahler with his Eighth Symphony, the so-called Symphony of 1,000, because it would typically take 1,000 people to perform it the way that Mahler wanted. We have Charles Ives, and we have Olivier Messiaen, and we have Stockhausen. And I'm going to talk about big music. And coming up next week on Theater Thursday is a very interesting film from 1980, starring Jodie Foster, called Foxes by Adrian Lyne, British director who later went on to make a bunch of big hit films like Fatal Attraction. What was it called? 9.5 Weeks? Is that 9.5 Weeks? Just rubbish, absolute pandering rubbish films. But this one is not rubbish. It's about 4 troubled girls in high school living in the San Fernando Valley. outside Los Angeles, and their rather anarchic lives and loves. So that's what I'm going to be talking about next week. So time to wrap it up. I've gone a little long. Oh, I'll be back on tomorrow, 7 p.m. Pacific. Sorry, 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. I get a little woozy after more than 2 hours of talking nonstop. Yes, back tomorrow at 4 p.m. Pacific, 7 p.m. Eastern. If you like the show and would like to make a donation to the live stream, my PayPal account is linked to kevin_grace@hotmail.com. If you're in Canada, donations may be made directly to the live stream via interact@kevingrace@shaw.ca. And as always, I leave you with this. In these days of social atomization and civilizational collapse, I do dearly wish that you, my dear viewers and listeners, manage to forge a genuine human connection in order to ease the burden. Good night.